Two of my favorite features of Fire Emblem have always been magic and the attractive male characters. Put these together and you get the Sage class from Engage, as a strong tome user with an interesting design. I quickly realized that with free reclassing, you can have a whole team of Sages, with emblems giving them each a unique role. And so, this led to my perfect playthrough, beating Fire Emblem Engage with only male Sages. My rules are, Master and Second Seals must be immediately used to get units into Sage, and as many male Sages as possible must be deployed. I'm playing on Maddening Classic Fix mode, and with limited DLC. This means I can use the Ancient Well for SP books, I can play the Fell Xenologue for Gregory and the Extra Master and Second Seal, and I can complete Divine Paralogs for the sake of Tiki and Tome and Staff proficiencies. Lastly, I'm approaching the game with my usual playstyle, which I would roughly describe as casual turns efficient. This means striking a satisfying balance between completionist goals, like training a full team, mostly routing maps, and getting all side objectives, and minimizing turn counts. Since you can't actually get a Sage until Chapter 7, I'll go ahead and just give a quick recap for how the early game went. I kept Marth on Alear, gave Sigurd to Alfred, Celica to Clan, and Micaiah to Boucheron, giving us a core team that could perform well early on, while getting enough levels to promote. Clan in particular put in a lot of work, quickly covering ground with Warp Ragnarok, doubling with the Might Augmented Seraphim for big damage, and dodge tanking decently well between Terrain and the Sigurd Engrave. Between all these kills and the arena experience, I got him up to level 10 just before Chapter 7, ready to promote into Sage right after getting the first Master Seal from Anna's Paralogue. His main feature is a high speed stat that lets him double with minimal supports, but he needs a lot of damage boosting to keep up with 1 rounds, and if he relies on the High Might Bolganone, then he gets way down a lot. Still, he's both strong and fast enough with Celica to demolish everything up through Chapter 10. Knowing that tomes will be our exclusive weapon type, I went ahead and forged a fire into an Elfire for him. For now, I gave it the Micaiah Engrave for the plus 40 avoid boost, so on top of a first-rate meal and the HP tonic, Clan could reliably sweep the Grand Crossing. With Warp Ragnarok, I got him to the middle of the map turn 1, one-drowning the Lance Fighters, Archers, Sword Armors, and Axe Cavaliers. Then turn 2, he repeated the same sweep on the remaining generic enemies approaching from the east, clearing the way for everyone else to safely rush forward. Turn 3, I was already set to draw over Hortensia's group, switching to a Sigurd Engraved Fire to 1-round Rosado on the enemy phase. Then it just took 2 turns for my other units to catch up, and put enough damage together for the final kills. Echo let Clan defeat both Goldmary and the last Sword Flyer, and Alear 1-rounded Hortensia with a Lodestar Rush for a 5-turn rout. Before taking my DLC detour, I promoted Alear using Chapter 7's Master Seal, and both he and Clan reached 1000 SP to inherit Cantor. I already made a video covering the Tiki Paralogue, and the Fell Xenologue has fixed teams, so I'll skip over them and get right into our second Sage, Gregory. Not only does he have a really high magic growth, but he also has a huge base stat of 25 as a pre-promoted Sage. He also has great resistance, but his speed and hit rates are pretty terrible. You can still make him into a super unit, capitalizing on his magic to one-shot enemies, but I've already done a full video on that as well, so I figured I would limit his contributions to more of a support and filler combat role with Tiki. Completing the Fell Xenologue also means we get another Master Seal and our first Second Seal, so I'm able to reclass Alear into Sage before Chapter 8. His offensive potential is basically like Clan but a little worse, being pretty fast and having some personal magic to work with. Perhaps most importantly, Divinely Inspiring is a great source of damage boosting, especially when you have many units in a class that doesn't suit their combat potential. So he'll be better off helping our lead combat units rather than being one himself, but for now he's still pretty strong as a promoted unit with Marth. In Chapter 8, I had him walk around the east, teaming up with Alfred. With Sigurd's Gallop, they got off to a strong start, but Clan went even further, with Warp Ragnarok letting him get in range of most of the southwestern generic enemies turn 1. Once again, he reliably survived and one-rounded everything with the Micaiah Engraved Elfire, before moving on to provoke the bosses, starting with Kagetsu. The Micaiah Engrave nullified most of his crits, and Clan 2-shot Kagetsu between turn 2 enemy phase and turn 3 player phase. Meanwhile, Alear engaged with Marth so he could kill flyers with Mercurius, and Alfred provoked Zelkov on the same turn Clan provoked Ivy, setting us up to get both kills on turn 4 player phase. Clan and Alfred both did a little under half their HP, setting up Alir to defeat Zelkov with Lodestar Rush, and Alfred to defeat Ivy's first health bar with a momentum boost. Then after a bit of chip damage from Alchrist and Gregory, Diamant just barely got enough damage for the last Ivy kill, leaving just a few mages and flyers alive. With Chapter 8 completed, the shop's inventory is updated, meaning 1 more Master Seal and 3 Second Seals. Since we still have 1 Master Seal from the Fel Xenologue, this means we can promote and reclass 2 more units into Sage, and I chose the Royal Princes Alfred and Diamant. Alfred's personal bases are overall not great, especially in speed, but he at least has some strength and defense, and technically his +2 defense cap modifier means he can get over Sage's paltry cap of 20. Diamant also shares this defense cap modifier and all-around underwhelming stats in Sage, but he at least has a couple points of personal magic and build, and his personal skill can give good player face hit rates. We also got the Roy and Leaf emblems, which each have strong S-rank bond rings for the run. I ended up rigging 1 Olwen ring with Dire Thunder, and 2 Lilina rings with Raging Fire. I also used my SP books, so Diamant, Alchrist, and Amber could inherit Cantor, and before Diamant could get Frostbite from being severely underdressed, we move on to drive off Ivy for good in Chapter 9. I decided to give Clan a break, having Diamant take Celica and warp Ragnarok to the southeast turn 1. Alfred engaged with Sigurd to reach the northeast turn 1, setting me up to claim both forts turn 2 before Kagetsu and Zelkov could. The Avoid, combined with the Micaiah Engrave, let Diamant dodge tank the Axe Armors, and while Alfred didn't have quite so much Avoid, with just the Sigurd Engrave and fighting Lance Armors, he took less damage, so he could afford to get hit a few times. By turn 3, I had Alir and Gregory around to team up against Kagetsu, though Diamant was on his own and spent the rest of the map taking down Zelkov. Then turn 4, Alir got in range to provoke Ivy, whose generic enemies moved in a perfect way to show off the power of Tiki's Dark Breath on Gregory. With the Mystic tag, it becomes a magical attack that ignores half of the target's resistance, and with Gregory's huge magic, he can Oko multiple enemies at once. Everyone else then was free to attack Ivy, with Alir finishing the first health bar with Lodestar Rush, and Alfred taking the second with an Override for a turn 5 victory. As our final bit of preparations before leaving the early game, I switched the Elfire to the Sigurd Engrave, and forged it up to +3 for the extra might and 1 less weights. This gives us a super weapon that everyone on our team should be able to trade around and use to great avail. I also inherited Cantor on Boucheron, who had been getting plenty of levels from Micaiah healing, and in a support conversation, Diamant got to share his traumatic fear of magic with Alchrist. Sorry honey, but you're going to have to be brave for me as we take on Chapter 10. Once again, I had Alir and Alfred team up together, taking the eastern path, eventually getting the Goldmary kill with a Lodestar Rush into a momentum-boosted L-Surge to ensure perfect hits. Meanwhile, Diamant and Gregory took the west. Dark Breath couldn't quite Oko Rosado, but it set up the kill for Amber, who, with Leaf, I knew would be tanky enough to survive enemy phase. The highlights of the clear was Clan, though, who I gave Celica back so he could, again, warp Ragnarok into the main enemy formation and kill everything. Importantly, getting in range of Hortensia got her to start attacking instead of using Freeze, so after taking out the Fire Orb Mage, he could canter back and lead Hortensia in range of my other units. Turn 3, Alfred finished the first Hortensia kill, and Amber used his big strength to finish her second health bar with quadruple hits. So by turn 4, I had Clan ready to fight Morian, one-rounding both health bars between enemy and player phase. By turn 6, I was approaching Hyacinth, with Alfred getting an override off against the final generic enemies, Okoing the mages thanks to the Mystic tag's damage boost. Hyacinth seemed to not want to move, so I just trapped him turn 7, so that over the course of 2 turns, I was able to deal enough damage in spite of his high resistance. In the end, a Lodestar Rush took out the first health bar, and Clan and Amber were able to set up the last kill fittingly for Diamant. Ultimately, an 8-turn complete rout. Going into Chapter 11, we lose all our emblems, which is honestly a pretty big hit for my team's combat and movement capabilities. But at least with last chapter's Master Seal, I can promote and reclass for our 6th Sage, Boucheron. His main deal is having no personal magic whatsoever, but I honestly don't think he has the worst combat potential, because his speed is fine, and he has the build to not get weighed down by Bokonon at all. I didn't have any big plans for him, but I did think it would be fun to give him a moment, at least in this chapter, while the enemies are still weak. After using the first enemy as a cancer opportunity to get everyone out of Micaiah's freeze range, I had Boucheron rewarp south, taking the Sigurd Elfire to dodge tank in the thickets while one-rounding the Leaf Corrupted and an Archer. From there, I pretty much just continued moving south with Boucheron to clear the eastern side, while everyone else teamed up for kills in the west. By turn 4, I was approaching the escape point, with Boucheron and clan clearing out the final lance fighters on enemy phase. So by the next player phase, I could focus on killing the mini-bosses, with the entire southern half of the map cleared and Ilir escaping on turn 5. Going into the Solm Arc, the shop updates once again, giving us the seals for more sages. We no longer have emblems that give tome and staff proficiencies, so I have to stick with the pre-Chapter 10 units for now, deciding on Alchrist and Amber. I suppose Alchrist has above average personal dex, but nothing else is super impressive in Sage, and I've left him underleveled. Amber, on the other hand, has basically no magic and is actively slow, but he actually has the highest strength of all male units. As I would soon learn, making use of physical emblem weapons is very important for dealing with high resistance enemies, so I'll be going all in on Amber as a combat unit, while leaving Alchrist to staff and emblem utility. I did Lucina's paralog right away, where I gave Amber both of her early game energy drops and bow focus, setting him up to eventually be our main Lin user. I also decided to give Clan the Lilina Bond Ring for Raging Fire's 20% damage boost going forward, and Diamant the Olwen Bond Ring for decently strong and accurate Dire Thunders. With that, Clan was able to one-round both the Berserkers and Sages in the east, while Diamant could help scrape out kills in the west. He also reached level 5, learning Sage's class skill of Spell Harmony. It provides +1 attack for each adjacent tome ally when initiating combat, which isn't typically relevant, but when my whole team is tome users that really appreciate damage boosts, it actually ends up being pretty useful. When it came time to fight Lucina, I made sure to set up Lin's doubles and hit her with a Divinely Inspiring boosted Astra Storm, leaving Clan in range to fight her on enemy phase. She's a pretty strong counter to our team with big speed and resistance, but with careful planning, I was able to get all 3 of her kills turn 5. Ilir finished the first health bar, and Clan set up the second kill for Amber. Then for the last health bar, Gregory hit hard with Dark Breath, setting up Diamant to get the kill, doubling because of Dire Thunder, and getting Divinely Inspiring and Spell Harmony boosts to deal enough damage. With Lucina's full bond ranks unlocked, I used the arena to get Amber Parthia, so he could use a stronger bow and get double XP gain for more strength level ups. I also started the long trend of inheriting Speed Plus on various units, before moving on to Chapter 12 in the Solm Deserts, where sages are slightly more appropriately dressed. Without any flyers or a covert Astra Storm, I wasn't able to win before the turn 3 reinforcements appeared, but I was at least able to outpace the turn 6 ones. I had Alfred as the new Lin user fight through the north with our new Solm recruits Fogado, Pendreo, and Bunet, while everyone else moved around between the center and south. Amber got some Parthia one-shots and finished the Wolf Knight, while Diamant used Divinely Inspiring and Spell Harmony to one-round the Swordmaster. To get the Martial Monk in the northwest moving, I had Alfred utilize Obstruct to get a cancer opportunity, so he could Astra Storm them turn 3. By this point, I had defeated most of the enemies, but I couldn't actually defeat the Martial Monk or Axe Fighter in the west, so reinforcements showed up. The promoted enemies couldn't be one-rounded, and my units were pretty spread out, so it ended up taking 2 turns to clean them up. A pretty chill map, and the main takeaway is our new cute recruits, and Bunet. Fogado and Bunet don't have tome and staff proficiency, but as a natural mage, Pendreo does, so we can reclass him into Sage right away. Not only does he have solid magic, but he also has great speed and the build to keep that speed when using Bolganon. He even has good hits, and his main issue is just low defense, making him a glass cannon. I won't actually be investing in him much, as he can reach most one-rounds with minimal support, and I'd rather give the strongest emblems and stat boosters to other units, so we can have multiple one-round KO machines. Though as will be the case with all our post-Chapter 10 units, he can't get Canter until Chapter 18, making it harder to keep him in the front of aggressive plays. Not that this is a big deal for Chapter 13, where the fog, obstacles, and choke points make us go nice and slow. I sent most of my units east to support Tamara's group, with Pendreo eventually taking the lead and destroying enemies with Raging Fire. Meanwhile, Gregory and Boucheron cleared the way for Clan to sweep the west. He had to rely on some dodges to survive multiple attacks, but with the Second Engrave and enemy axe fighters having low hit rates, he was generally fine to hold forward. Lastly, I left Amber in the back, echoing flyers coming from the Oasis with Parthia. By turn 5, both groups had reunited in the south, and while Boucheron stayed back to get the rescue village, I had most everyone else to handle Wolf Knight Isle. Like Lucina, Wolf Knights are a hard counter to our mages, with high speed and resistance and physical 1-2 range. I was just barely able to 2 or 3 shot these wolves on player phase, then got ready to fight the barbarian bosses. They hit really hard against our frail mages, and I knew there would be problems if left alive for too long, so I roughly planned out how to defeat all 4 health bars in 1 turn ahead of time. Both Clan and Pendreo could double, and with Divinely Inspiring and the Forged Elfire, had enough damage to 1 round. Clan could defeat 1 health bar on enemy phase, and I had Gregory and Alfred team up to defeat a second on the following player phase, with Alfred taking the Forged Elfire from Clan. I had Alfred canter away so Alir could take the Elfire to 1-round the Elwyn Mage, and then he cantered away so Clan could take his Elfire back to get the 3rd boss kill while having Divinely Inspiring. Then finally, Clan cantered away so Pendreo could take the Elfire and have Divinely Inspiring to get the 4th and final boss kill, ending the map on turn 10. Before moving on in the story, I took a detour to Veronica's Paralog to get tome and staff proficiency for our Solmic units. However, I learned that Veronica's Paralog is really tough when you only have magic users, with Veronica and her many sages having huge resistance, and even the physical enemies like generals having a surprising amount of magical bulk. And so, this ended up being a true trial, in which I had to prove my mastery of sages before I could earn access to more. Clan was barely able to 1-round some enemies with all the damage boosting I could muster, leading Alir, Gregory, and Boucheron in the west against mostly strong physical enemies. Most of the enemy sages were in the east, against which my plan was to barely hit hard enough with Pendreo so that Amber could pull out Lucina's Parthia to get the kill. This meant I could only really deal with 1 at a time, and whenever Amber's engage meter ran out, I had to stall for time while he built it back up. This led to a lot of obstruct usage, especially as the central reinforcements hit me with a pincer attack, but with painstaking consideration, I was slowly able to make progress. By turn 9, I had reached the final islands before Veronica. At this point, I needed Alir to engage with our new Ike emblem to tank in the west, holding off enemies long enough for Clan and Gregory to thin them out. My idea for Ike Alir was to have Divinely Inspiring immediately set up against all the enemies he could draw over on enemy phase, but I'll admit this interaction wasn't actually that relevant, and I mostly just appreciated having a unit get tanky with Lavu's friends and have enough speed to not get doubled. It took until turn 19 to handle all the final island enemies and reinforcements, but I still had to handle the trial's greatest challenge, Veronica. It took 2 very tense turns, but I ended up being able to get all 3 kills with careful use of my emblems. Clan set up the first kill for Amber with Parthia, Pendreo and Lucina's chain attacks set up the second kill for Alfred, using Lynn's killer bow and her double's chain attacks. Then on the final turn, Alir and Gregory got enough damage with Ike's Irvin and Tiki's Tail Smash, so Amber could again get a kill with Parthia, ending us off with a massive 22 turns. Oof. The payoff was well worth the struggle though, as I could use the arena to get staff and tome proficiency on any of our post-Chapter 10 recruits. But as a footnote, I should mention that Veronica's tome proficiency is locked behind bond rank 16, which cost a total of 4,900 bond fragments to get from the arena per unit. And with 3 deployment slots to fill out, I needed 13,700 fragments. I was a little short and ended up selling a ton of weapons so I could make Elusia's level 3 donation, earning not just our first Bolganone, but also 1,000 bond fragments. This served as the final push for getting Fugado, Kagetsu, and Bunei into Sage. As Sage number 10, Bunei falls under the Alfred category of having low personal stats not well suited for Sage combat. There's still plenty of filler contributions he can make between utility emblems and staff access, but I don't even care about his character much, and I'll admit that he's basically just here to fill out the team. On the other hand, Sage number 11 Kagetsu has great speed, and solid strength, build, and hit rates, making him an effective user of physical emblem weapons. He also has a bit of magic and good defenses, so his main downsides are just the lack of mid-game counter access, and neither of his offenses being particularly high. Lastly, we have Sage number 12 Fogado, and I knew I wanted to do great things with him. He has the highest speed of all male sages, with a +3 cap modifier to boot, and I would say his magic is above average for male units, being a bit stronger than Clan and Kagetsu. His build, defense, and hit rates aren't the highest, but if we want someone to reach 1-round thresholds, Fogado is our closest option after Pendreo, mostly just needing a big damage boost. Like our other new sages, he doesn't have Canter and is a bit underleveled, but I decided to fix the latter issue by making him one of the leading forces, as we move to reclaim his palace in Chapter 14. With one of the Raging Fire Rings, his damage was more than fine, burning through a ton of enemies in the east. I switched Lucina over to Alchrist so he could also catch up on levels using Parthia, but the real star of the map ended up being Pendreo. I warped him over the gap turn 1, used Obstruct to keep a hero away, and then he was able to dodge tank sweep everything else with the Sigurd Engraved Elfire. A little inconsistent, but he was able to survive, taking a few turns to clear out the area in front of the boss room. Meanwhile, Boucheron and Alfred fought through the west, so that by turn 4, the southern half of the map was cleared. Again, Wolf Knights proved to be a bit of a struggle, but Alir was able to tank them with Ike and accurately get damage off with L-Surge, setting up for a Dire Thunder kill. I left Diamant, Amber, and Bunet behind to get the chests in the northeast, and Kagetsu, Boucheron, and Gregory in the northwest, but everyone else rushed towards the bosses, instigating them by turn 8. Pendreo one-rounded a Marnie health bar on enemy phase, and Fogado just about defeated Mavier on enemy phase, completely one-rounding his second health bar on the following player phase with a Lucina chain attack. Likewise, Alir one-rounded Marnie's second health bar with a chain attack, and then Clan and Pendreo could each one-round Zephyia. Then, after taking a turn to walk forward, I was easily able to take out Hortensia in one turn, setting up kills for Alchrist and Fogado, before having Pendreo one-round her final health bar, ending on turn 11. Now that I had a chance to try out a lot of units and builds, I decided to make some important team decisions, going into the tough Lyn Paralog. I switched Ike to Clan, gave Lucina to Alir, and boosted Fogado, giving him the Chapter 9 Spirit Dust and our new Byleth emblem. With this setup, I was able to sweep all of Lyn's Bow Knights. In the northeast, Alir provided both Bonded Shield and Divinely Inspiring for Fogado, who could counterattack even the Longbow Bow Knights, thanks to Byleth's Mystic Tag weapon, Thyrsus, giving +2 attack range for tomes. Bonded Shield only has an 80% proc rate with the Mystic Tag, but Fogado's high avoid from speed and the Sigurd Engrave meant his odds of survival were still quite high. In the northwest, Clan tanked with Lagu's Friend active, counterattacking the Longbow Bow Knights with Thoron to 2-round them. He needed Physic and Obstruct support to stay alive while keeping my other units out of range, but he was able to clear everything else before his engage meter ran out. The southeast had it a little more rough, but Kagetsu, Diamant, Boucheron, and Alfred were able to scrape out their few kills together fine enough. By turn 5, I had killed basically everything and was moving in on Lyn. She seems scary, but she doesn't start acting until turn 7, so I was able to safely have a bunch of units get in range. I traded around the Lucina Engraved Thoron and L-Surge, so everyone could reliably deal solid damage in spite of her high speed and resistance, getting all 3 kills over 2 turns for a turn 8 route. Though I would eventually settle on keeping Ike on Clan, I switched Ike to Fogado so he could be the lead unit in Chapter 15, putting Byleth on Alfred. With Thyrsus, he could reach to break down the first door at turn 1, letting me immediately warp Fogado into the first room. At this point, he was strong enough to one-round unpromoted enemies without a magical emblem, and Ike's defensive boost let him enemy phase without bonded shield supports. This way, I was also free to put Raging Fire on Boucheron, letting him one-round enemies back in the starting area. So by turn 2, I had the first rooms mostly cleared, Seedle recruited, and the northern hallway opened up. I can't really use Seedle as a Sage because of how Dancer can't reclass into promoted classes until level 21, but he at least got to contribute as a Dancer in this one chapter. Combined with a lot of precise reposition, Goddess Dance, and Cancer plays, I got the rest of my army to catch up with Fogado and propel him even further. Playing around the miasma also took some meticulous planning, but I was able to clear the northern hallway by turn 4, and then move on to the eastern room by turn 5. With a Great Ether, he was able to safely draw over enemies and clear miasma, but from there, my progress stalled a bit. I couldn't defeat everything on player phase, and needed a couple turns for Fogado to clear out the enemies, using Bonded Shield now that Alir caught up and Ike ran out. Still, by turn 8, I had Fogado in the final room, with both Lagu's Friend and Bonded Shield to keep him alive, while Obstructs forced the enemies to attack into him off of Miasma. Then on turn 9, I pulled together everyone's actions, a Goddess Dance, and Rescue, to defeat the surviving enemies, reach the Talisman chest, and get Cedal to the escape points. We make it out of the ruins, and scare off Vale with all the Royals' collective abs, before heading off to another set of ruins in Ike's Paralogue. Like Veronica's Paralogue, the map has some sages alongside surprisingly bulky physical enemies, so I stacked all my offensive boosts on a few units to reach 1 rounds. Fogado took Lolina and did a Bonded Shield sweep in the east, Gregory engaged with Tiki to fend off the southern enemies, while Clan and Pendreo did their best to carry the west. They could kill individual enemies just fine, but you can't use Ike in Ike's Paralogue, so they heavily relied on their new emblem Corrin's ability to freeze enemies to stay alive. I decided to have my Corrin user be Pendreo, because while her magic boost might not help as much as Raging Fire, I figured Corrin would be enough for Pendreo to keep up with most 1 rounds, and Draconic Hex and Dreadful Aura can be better on elite combat units, rather than a filler units left behind in the action. A little tense to figure out which enemies I could kill and which I had to freeze, but nothing too bad. Even the sages were fine, because with Lyn back on Amber for the rest of the run, he could start doubling with her speed boosts, and killing low defense enemies with her bows. After beating the sages, Amber went to the southeast to defeat a general that drops gold, while everyone else met up in the north to take on Ike. Fortunately, he has low resistance, and I could straight up 1 round with Fogado and Pendreo. So I ended up getting all 3 kills over just 1 enemy and player phase, ending the map with all the gold collected by turn 5. We then head to our last Soulmate conflict in Chapter 16. With Fogado now established as a dominant combat force, I went ahead and gave him the boots from Chapter 14, and Byleth for 1 last chapter. With a reposition and warp, I got him onto the central island turn 1, using Rescue to get Alir over to provide Bonded Shield, as he swept the Axe Fighters, Paladin, Bow Knight, and Mage Knights. This chapter also introduces us to another challenge for our sages, Corrupted Worms. Here I got to use Rosado, using Erica's Lunar Brace and Corrupted Effectivity, and Goldmary's Chain Attacks to break through, but going forward they get trickier, with even greater defenses, and enough attack to Oko or low HP sages. Still, Fogado put up a pretty good fight on his own, reaching with Thyrsus and coming close to 2-rounding the second worm between player and enemy phase, setting up Rosado to kill by turn 4. By then, I had gotten everyone onto the central island and ready to rush the bosses in the west, as soon as the tides went back down. Well, I accidentally let Clan get stuck in the freeze loop back in the east, but with the rescue, I was able to keep him out of danger. When the tides went down turn 6, I went for a big Goddess Dance turn to take out Marnie's group on player phase, leaving Pendreo in range of Mavier. So the next turn, all I had to do was have Rosado visit the village and take out Mavier's group. Just as an update, this took Fogado up to level 10, with enough speed and build for me to feel confident using an emblem purely for damage over speed going forward. But yeah, that's Chapter 16 completed in 7 turns. Next up is the climactic face down in Chapter 17, but before that, I'd like to take a moment to talk about Chromatic Trout. This fish can only be found starting after Chapter 16, if you fish in a specific spot in the fishing pond, with at most a 20% appearance rate if you specifically fish during the morning or daytime cycle. However, you get a whole 500 bond fragments for fishing it up, which is doubled to 1,000 if Chromatic Trout is the bonus fish of the day. And with the Sturdy Rod having 6 uses, this means up to 6,000 bond fragments per chapter. I was in need of a lot to afford tome proficiency for our new team member Rosado, on top of keeping up with typical expenses like skill inheritance. And so, with such an alluring set of bond fragments just lying around in the pond, I started the cycle of resetting for the right time, the right bonus, and the right fish size to get a chance to pull up this Chromatic Trout 6 times every chapter. And it gets even better, because this stupid fish has a genuinely infuriating level of difficulty to catch, needing to pull at just the right angle and intense smashing. I failed so many times, but after practicing day in and day out, I honed my skills until becoming a fishing expert. Soon enough, I could reel in chromatic trout after chromatic trout after chromatic trout, ending the run with 108 for a cumulative profit of 108,000 bond fragments. I'd estimate each chapter's fishing session took around 30 minutes, which makes for 9 hours spent solely on fishing. And, I'll leave it up to you to decide if that's worth the time. At the very least, I knew Rosado appreciated the bond fragments, getting the proficiencies to reclass for our 13th Sage. His magical combat is technically above average for male units, and while neither his magic or speed are super impressive, both should be high enough to reach 1-round thresholds with strong boosts. I didn't have any big plans for him, and decided to utilize his personal skill that gives 20 hits against male enemies, and his great base SP, to hit hard with Thoron while debuffing enemies with Draconic Hex. As one more detour before Chapter 17, let's speed through some paralogs. First up, Byleth. Here I gave Erica to Fogado, who would be his main emblem for the rest of the run, providing the biggest magical damage boost tied with Celica between the plus magic and bravery. This let him, Pendreo, and Clan one-round enemies, while Gregory shot down Swordmasters with Thoron, and Amber used Lynn's dragon-effective Mulagir to crush these phantom worms. By turn 5, I cleared the northern section and instigated Byleth, with my units ready to take out the enemies that got warped over the gap, then intercept Byleth once he made it to the bottom of the stairs in the east. He's one of the tough, high-resistance bosses, but at this point we have big damage stacking and Draconic Hex debuffs, so I was able to pull off 1 round with Amber and Fogado, winning by turn 9. Next up, Corrin. The big takeaway here is that I put Ike back on Clan, pushing him to reach 1 rounds with Speed Plus and inheriting Erica's Gentility, which also further boosted his bulk, so he could reliably sweep promoted enemies all on his own. While he was killing everything in the east, Fogado crossed the water to Bonded Shield sweep the west. After a few turns of killing most of the generic enemies, I moved on to Corrin. She's one of the trickier bosses, because, well, you can't use Corrin to lock her down with Dreadful Aura. But I was still able to freeze her with Gregory, having good hit rates between his high magic and having inherited Divine Pulse with high luck from Tiki. So I was able to stall for time as I finished taking out all the Hoshiden and Norian stand-ins with gold drops, before taking out Corrin herself over a couple turns. In the end, a 6-turn clear. And finally, Erica. A pretty big map, but put shortly, I had Amber snipe the Phantom Worms with Mulagir, then used a Goddess Dance turn 1 to immediately split up, with Clan leading the west with Bonded Shield supports, Fogado leading the east with Ike, and Pendreo holding up the back with Corrin's Mystic Vein of Flames. With so many enemies and reinforcements to fight through, I ended up taking until turn 5 at the choke points to clear everything out and move south. By then, Amber's emblem meter had run out, so I had to scrape out the High Priest and Sage kills with Divinely Inspiring True Damage and Lucina Chain attacks. However, I did have him engaged when it came time to fight Erica. So after locking her down with Dreadful Aura and using Goddess Dance, I was narrowly able to punch through her high resistance and get all her kills by turn 8. Now we can finally move on to Chapter 17. Without any flyers, my turn 1 plan wasn't quite as aggressive as normal, but I still made sure to defeat all the nearby generals and halberdiers, and I used Obstructs and the Vein of Flame so a clear path to the center of the map would open up turn 2. I had Clan handle the southern path to Marnie with support from Alfred, while I left Amber, Bouchron, and Gregory behind to handle Gris, and everyone else charged towards the center. Fogado took Erica back and used Sieglind against the first Corrupted Worm, just barely 1-rounding between its Corrupted Effectivity and Lunar Brace. Then with some repositions, a Goddess Dance, and a Warp, I got Pendreo in range of Mavier's group with Bonded Shield supports. With Corrin, he locked down the Worm, making sure he could kill it on enemy phase along with the Royal Knights and Paladins. With that, most of the generic enemies were out of the way, and the main threat was just the multiple bosses, which my other units were safe to approach and team up against. Notably, I had Fogado around, so after Pendreo hit an enemy with Dreadful Aura and Draconic Hex, it was simple enough to tear through their health bars over a couple turns. This happened for Mavier and Zephyia over turns 3 and 4, then Hyacinth and Veil for turns 5 and 6. Of course, without a dancer, Fogado and Pendreo could each only target one boss per turn, and it was pretty close to have my other units team up for kills before Dreadful Aura wore off. You could also say that Marnie was tough to kill, constantly getting healed by High Priest and surviving with Roy's holdouts. But eventually, the timing worked out for Alfred to get the final kill, just as everyone else was finishing up the Veil kills with one last Goddess Dance. With only a couple High Priests remaining, I all but routed by turn 6. With Leaf and Sigurd rejoining, this meant all the Solm units could finally inherit Cantor, as well as more emblem paralogs, starting with Sigurd's. More emblems also means we'll have the potential for more strong units, and I decided to take this map to catch Kagetsu up to speed. I gave him Lucina and the Bond rank for Parthia, with which he could get a full level basically every other kill. With Parthia being a bow and me not having a dancer, it might seem like Kagetsu's kill opportunities would be limited at a fast pace, but by having Clan weaken a bunch of enemies and utilizing Freeze, I was able to ensure Kagetsu got a kill both on each player and enemy phase. While they funneled all these kills to Kagetsu on the southern path, I had Amber and Figado lead the north, using Mulagir and Sieglind to take out the many sages. By turn 5, I had defeated the mini-boss and lowered the drawbridge, taking the next few turns to fight Sigurd and the tough Julius and Ishtar stand-ins in the southwest. With Torrential Roar, I froze and debuffed both, after which Amber could get kills with Mulagir, and everyone else could set up kills for Kagetsu, with a Goddess Dance to get all 6 of their kills over 2 turns. After all this action, Kagetsu got 7 levels, still not quite matching up with my strongest units, but at least having the speed to start doubling now. Oh, and Sigurd was fine. He doesn't have too much speed or resistance, so Clan and Figado could easily take out all his health bars by turn 8. For Chapter 18, I typically just go for a quick 1 turn, but doing so for my team while getting both chests felt a little out of scope without using a bunch of warps. So instead, I just went for a 2 turn, which gave me the opportunity to get some kills on Kagetsu and Rosado. With Erika and Bonded Shield, Kagetsu swept most of the eastern boat turn 1, while Rosado took Raging Fire to kill a few enemies in the western boats, and Clan got some kills while walking to the western chest. Then turn 2, I just had Kagetsu and Clan open the chests, and with the Goddess Dance, I got Pendreo and Sigurd to reach a beam. With the Forged Elfire, he 1-rounded, and he just had to dodge 1 of 2 attacks to survive and get both kills between player and enemy phase. And with the Sigurd Engrave, her hit was all the way down at 10, resulting in a pretty reliable victory on turn 2. As a much more exciting map, we have Chapter 19's Ghost Town, where we have our final fights against Mavir and Marnie, with a lot of miasma to work around. As usual, I made a plan to get in range of Mavir's group turn 1, so I could sweep many generic enemies and trigger Mavir to rescue Marnie right away. Flyers usually help out with this, being able to move across the gap in the center and any flame tiles you create, as well as ignoring Miasma's defense debuffs. As it turns out though, with a couple rescues, a Goddess Dance, and Obstructs, I was still able to get Figado in range of a bunch of enemies that couldn't attack him from Miasma, with Alir adjacent for Bonded Shield. With Speed Taker, he was even fast enough to double the heroes, so by turn 2 I had the entire center of the map cleared, and was in range of both bosses. Of course, I also wanted to visit both villages, so I had Clan tank the south and defeat enemies over a few turns, while Amber, Gregory, and Kagetsu teamed up in the north. They had a Corrupted Worm to fight against, but an Astra Storm into doubling with Mulagir and Lynn's doubles chain attacks was able to get the kill. By turn 4, I was clear to visit the villages, then defeat the enemies with item drops. Clan destroyed the Elixir Warrior after Rosado applied Draconic Hex, and Amber was able to 1-drown the Draco Shield Barbarian, since I had occupied the tile with Miasma that he normally spawns on. Then for the boss kills, it was just a matter of locking them down with Corrin and taking them out with Figado and Pendreo's huge offenses. Definitely not a rout, but I still felt satisfied getting the boss kills and taking home the treasure in 4 turns. With Roy and Micaiah back under our control, we have even more paralogs to cover. For Roy's Wyvern-heavy paralog, I decided to give Rosado and Boucheron a moment to shine. Despite being relatively underleveled, Boucheron just needed speed plus 4 to double, and with Excalibur, was able to Bonded Shield sweep the north. For Rosado, I decided to go all out and forge up a big Excalibur, so that with Erika's plus 8 magical damage and Vantage active, he could OHKO all the Wyverns coming from the south on enemy phase. It took some slight obstruct usage to ensure all the flyers attacked into Rosado, but after 5 or so turns, I was approaching the final stretch, and soon enough started fighting Roy across the wall. Holdout means you need at least 6 attacks to defeat his 3 health bars, but he's not super strong, so after a couple turns and a goddess dance, he went down simple enough. I even left some units behind to get the reinforcement gold drop, right before winning on turn 9. Next up, Leaf. Having no flyers meant my options for boss rushing were more limited, but I was still able to pull off my typical skip with Micaiah. I gave Sigurd back to Alfred, and with Gallop, he was able to chase down the lance fighters with item drops, alongside Amber's Astrostorm. By turn 2, I was set up to warp over Kagetsu and Alir to the Ballista by Leaf, taking advantage of an augmented boosted 10 range warp, and a tile in the east that's exactly 10 spaces away from a land tile near the starting positions. With that, Kagetsu was ready to start tearing through Leaf and his Mage Knights, using Roy and the newly unlocked Binding Blade to become a strong 1-2 range physical juggernaut. These Mage Knights do have Thoron for 3 range, but by keeping Leaf away for a turn with Freeze and positioning around the terrain, I forced most of them to attack at 2 range. Since Kagetsu was on his own as a combat unit, it took a few turns to get through Leaf's health bars, during which the units left behind in the west gathered the gold drops. With another Augment Warp, they got the jump on the Ballista, and with the Goddess Dance, got all the kills on the same player phase. From there, Clan walked east to get some kills in the center of the map, up until Kagetsu defeated Leaf's final health bar on turn 5. And lastly, Micaiah's Paralog. This one has an even simpler boss rush, since you can defeat a health bar and get Micaiah to start moving turn 1 with an Astrostorm, but I still made sure to defeat some generic enemies for experience first. With the rescue, I got Alchrist in range to use Instruct on Kagetsu, so he could one-round all the paladins in the southwest, with Roy's bulk and avoid from the Lucina engrave, giving him reliable enough survivability. As for the east, I gave Rosado Ike, so he could tank and sweep the Great Knights. He wouldn't be strong enough to one-round with Bolganone, but since they only have 1 range, I could use my new Elsurge strats. Elsurge naturally has 10 crits, which combined with Ike's Wrath and Korn's Engrave, gets you up to 70 crits, which makes getting 1 of 2 crits fairly reliable. Normally an issue with stacking the Korn Engrave with killer weapons is that you're stuck with terrible hit rates, but Elsurge doesn't have to worry about that with its infinite hit. After Rosado and Kagetsu got all their kills, I was able to walk everyone else forward, with Goddess Dance helping me get enough units in range of Micaiah. She has even greater speed and resistance than previous bosses, but she's so physically frail that Alfred's Tearfang and Amber's Mulagir made quick work of her. Nothing crazy, but a 2-turn victory. Back to chapter battles, I finally settled on giving Clan the Spirit Dust from chapter 16, then headed to the showdown against our fellow sage Gris in chapter 20. Even being familiar with the map, the fog can be annoying, so I cleared most of it by using Illum with Diamant, with Micaiah's Augment expanding it to a huge 12 range radius. With this vision, I was able to defeat one of Gris's health bars turn 1, with Vigado setting up the kill for Alfred. I also got the Entrap High Priest out of the way, with Amber sniping them down with a Divinely Inspiring and Lunar Brace boosted Astrostorm. With that, all the gimmicks of the map were basically done, so all I had to do was split into 2 groups and fight some enemies. At this point, enemy quality was getting a little concerning, with even the lead combat units cutting it close on 1 rounds. Still, it worked out well enough to have Kagetsu and Pendreo charge through the western path, with Gregory around to help 2-shot the speedy Swordmasters and Thieves. For the east, I had Clan tanking with Ike, with Vigado as the main hard hitter, and Alfred picking up some spare kills. Once I got to the end by turn 5, I froze the Wolf Knights with Korn, so I could safely draw over Gris and push for his remaining kills with the Goddess Dance on the following turn. And with Clan, Kagetsu, and Gregory retrieving the chests on the same turn, I was fine concluding the map by turn 6. A great map to beat, because now Celica is back in our army, and I immediately took to her Paralog. Another one that's simple enough to beat in a couple turns by just rushing the boss kills, but I decided to take a little more time and effort to clear out most of the generic enemies. With an Augment Warp, I got Clan, Kagetsu, and Rosado on the shore. I had Kagetsu one-round the Western High Priest and fight their conjured Swordmasters, staying in Celica's Warp Ragnarok range to get her moving. Amber defeated the Eastern High Priest with an Astrostorm, and I left Rosado in range to sweep the Central High Priest's conjured Wyvern Knights. Like Roy's Paralog, I gave him Erica and the strongest Excalibur I could muster, so with Vantage active, he one-shot them all before they had a chance to kill him. Then turn 2, I had Amber, Clan, Fagado, and Pendreo around to handle the Halberdiers, while Rosado and Alfred took out the Central High Priest before getting Augment rescued to safety. So by the end of turn 3, all I had to handle was the Phantom Worms that got warped over, and Celica. The worms crumbled to the dragon-effective Wormslayer and Mulagir, and while Celica was a little resilient, I had most of my army and Goddess Dance available, so I was able to defeat all her health bars and win by turn 3. We then moved to the late game, and in preparation of some tough chapters, I made some big inherits and reset for an S-rank Mei Bond Ring with Great Thunder, before moving to chapter 21. To get a strong hold of the map turn 1, I used Entrap on Zephyia, with Divine Pulse giving Diamant over a 70% chance to land. As usual, the generals were deceptively durable, so I had Alfred override them all, applying Draconic Hex and getting a bit of chip damage from the Mystic Tag's true damage bonus. Even then, I needed some very precise positioning to trade around my one big Bolganon Forge and utilize Lucina's chain attack, while also defeating Zephyia and clearing space for a Goddess Dance. With much planning, I pulled it off though, and was able to press forward with my main combat units. Clan ended in range of the Paladins in the east, Fagado defeated the first Corrupted Worm, Kagetsu ended in range of the Bow Knights, and Rosado as the new Celica user, warp Ragnaroked into range of the Wyvern Knights, with an Obstruct to keep him out of range of the Bow Knights. Clan relied on the Elsurge crit combo to one-round everything while tanking with Ike, Kagetsu swept with the Binding Blade, and Rosado did another Excalibur Vantage Oko sweep. So by turn 2, I had most everything handled, and was free to do an Augment Rewarp to rush Griss's group. Fail's group doesn't move off their protection tiles, and I had defeated the Entrap High Priest with an Astra Storm. So I could safely leave everyone nearby at the end of turn 2, ready to run up and defeat Fail. After a debuff, she's not really that strong, so I was able to take out her and most of her generics by turn 3. We then go straight into chapter 22, and I was really worried about this map. Without emblems, we lose out on access to physical weapons and our few defensive tools, so I pulled out the few S-rank bond rings I had collected, hoping that Raging Fire, Dire Thunder, and Great Thunder would be enough to let Fagado, Pendreo, and Kagetsu burn through enemies before we could get overwhelmed. Everything seemed to work out well at first, with Fagado sweeping the Royal Knights in the east, Clan fending off the heroes from the west, and Rosado taking out the first Wyvern Knights with Vantage Excalibur. I couldn't get in range of the Griffin Knights by the time they started moving, but I was able to one-shot them all on player phase, with Rosado, Fagado, and Kagetsu trading around the Excalibur and keeping high hit rates thanks to their personal skills and support bonuses. And with the Corrupted Worm falling to Gregory into Pendreo, I was able to safely retrieve the Lucina, Byleth, and Lyn emblems by turn 3. From there though, a horde of enemies gathered in the center of the map, while reinforcements started approaching from the north, composed of our worst matchups: Wolf Knights, Swordmasters, and Martial Masters. So even after some very precise Thoron trading and utilizing Divinely Inspiring and Spell Harmony, I couldn't accomplish a perfect player phase sweep, and needed Obstruct spam to stay safe on enemy phase. After much struggle, I reached the southern portion of the map turn 9, with Celica and Micaiah retrieved. I had left Fagado in the back, in hope of defeating reinforcements to end the map early, but this hurt my damage output for the final group of enemies. Pendreo and Kagetsu did their best, and I felt like I had put together as many player phase kills as I could, but I ultimately had to leave some enemies alive, relying on Obstruct and Freeze to keep safe. I couldn't quite reach the final set of emblem rings fast enough, so reinforcements spawned turn 11, which I had to take a couple turns to chase down. So while everyone in the south finished gathering the emblem rings, Fagado and Rosado swept through a few enemies in the north. In the end, a very stressful turn 12 victory. Going back to the Somniel, we get a chance to give our new recruit Mavier Tome Proficiency, reclassing him for our final 14th stage. Mavier has excellent magic, being even stronger than Pendreo, and he joins with the best defenses we could ask from a sage. He also has capped build to not get weighed down by Bolganon, but his below average speed means he can't actually double many late game enemies at base. My plan was to pair him with our last emblem, Marth, with the speed boost and divine speed, at least letting him one round mid-speed tier enemies like Great Knights, and get occasional Mercurius kills to catch up on levels. Before we can move on to the final stretch of chapters though, we have 2 more paralogs to get through. Yippee! Marth's paralog is at least a short one, where, as usual, I went for a boss rush, but slowed down just enough to get some generic kills and side goals. After having Alfred chase down the secret book thief, I had Diamant entrap the hero mini-boss with 2000 gold, with Pendreo using Corrin to debuff and freeze them for the rest of the map. They have 3 health bars and huge stats, so I needed a lot of attacks to take them out, between Pendreo, Gregory, Diamant, Clan, and Alfred. Everyone else then worked together in the east, and with some repositions and a warp, I was able to break down the door, get one sage out of the way with an Astrostorm, and set up Kagetsu to sweep the generals and snipers. Between his natural bulk, Avoid, and Bonded Shield, he was able to survive, despite late game enemies having really high attack. Turn 2, I pulled Kagetsu back, clearing out more sages while keeping out of Marth's attack range. So by the next turn, Marth was front and center, and I still had Goddess Dance available. After a Draconic Hex debuff, Kagetsu even doubled, so I was pretty easily able to defeat Marth by turn 3. As a much more challenging map, we head to our final paralog and final route map, where we seek to reclaim the Pack Train. I felt like it should be easier than Chapter 22, since we have all the emblem rings, but enemy quality is just so high, and I spread my army thin to take an aggressive approach. At least I started off strongly, defeating the first hero and halberdier formations on player phase, and warp Ragnarocking Rosado in range of barbarians. With the augmented Seraphim, he one-rounded, and by ending his action on pillars, he was able to dodge tank fairly consistently. Then turn 2, I handled the Mage Knights, with Alfred Okoing both in the west, with a max momentum boost and a Might's Augment on Sigurd's Rider's Bane. So by turn 3, I was ready to take on the boss group. Fogado engaged with Erica for Sieglind to take out the Martial Masters, and everyone else's magical damage output was respectable against this frail, debuffed barbarian boss. However, everything started going south once I moved on to the second phase, with a ton of reinforcements and most of my strong emblem users running out of their engage meter. Fogado barely reached 1 rounds to clear the northwest, but my damage output for the northeast was lacking, and they had to go up against a terrible assortment of enemies, between Wolf Knights, Thieves, and Mage Knights. I had foolishly sent Pendreo and Elir to the southwest, so I had to spam Obstruct to survive multiple enemy phases. At least Fogado and Pendreo did well clearing out the west with Bonded Shield support, and after several very stressful turns, I had regrouped everyone and was ready to fight the boss group in the center. I still had Bonded Shield, so Fogado was able to thin their numbers before I hit them with a Draconic Hex Override and Dreadful Auras to weaken their final formation. By now, I had most everyone's engage meters refilled, and with everyone attacking at full force and a Goddess Dance, I was able to end the map strong, completing the routes on turn 10. We're not quite out of the woods yet though, as Chapter 23 is another overwhelming map. There's not a simple boss skip, and I wasn't confident about my matchup against Freeze, Corrupted Worms, and many high-resistance enemies. But after spending a long time in preps, I managed to put together a satisfactory clear. In the east, I had Diamant entrap a Bow Knight and Mage Knight for the Goddess icon. Then I had Kagetsu stay in range of the nearby Swordmasters and Mage Knights, with an Obstruct to keep him out of the Royal Knight's freeze range. For the west, I had Alfred and Fogado team up against the first Corrupted Worm, while Clan moved to the choke points, and Rosado warp Ragnarok in range of the Griffin Knights. Clan one-rounded everything with L-Surge, and because enemies prefer to attack over using staves, the Griffin Knights all attacked into Rosado, which he could still Oko with Vantage Excalibur. From there, I had Kagetsu and Elir stay in the east to defeat as many enemies as they could, while everyone else rushed west, with rewarp, rescues, canter, and repositions, in preparation for the boss kills. Fogado continued killing Corrupted Worms, and Clan continued leading at choke points, clearing the way to draw over the bosses on turn 3. Amber got off some damage on Grist with Astrostorm, and I left Fogado in range to defeat his first health bar on enemy phase. I needed an Obstruct to keep the Wyvern Knights away from Fogado, and so they instead attacked into Clan, who one-rounded most with Excalibur. On the following turn, I was more than prepared to defeat the bosses, with Alfred debuffing both with a Draconic Hex Override and a Goddess Dance to get multiple big hits off. I had Mavier with Lodestar Rush, Amber with Mulagir and Linstubble's chain attacks, and Pendreo and Fugado were just really strong. Kagetsu and Delir didn't make it through all the enemies in the east, but I was still able to defeat quite a lot before finishing the map on turn 4. In contrast, Chapter 24 was a pretty chill map, as it went for a short but satisfying one turn. Without a dancer, I couldn't pull off the typical double augment rewarp strategy, and no flyers made working around the fog and rocks a little awkward, so I had to improvise a new skip. I could still rely on one rewarp, which I had comprised of 3 boss killers, and Delir, who I had be the Byleth user because of his starting position and ability to provide Divinely Inspiring. I got Kagetsu into position with the reposition, Pendreo got hit with a double warp, and Alfred engaged with Sigurd to rescue Fugado before cantering out of the way. Diamant could then rewarp the 4, with the boss killers defeating the Corrupted Worm and getting refreshed alongside Diamant with a Goddess Dance. Then Diamant just barely reached past Delir with an Augment and Trap, and I had Rosado get rescued so he could warp Ragnarok and apply Draconic Hex. From there, I had 3 strong units, each ready to defeat one of past Delir's 3 health bars. Kagetsu finished the first kill with Bolganone, then Pendreo and Fugado each one-rounded using Nova's Brave effect, stacking enough damage with Divinely Inspiring and Spell Harmony. And that's Chapter 24 completed in one turn with no dancer. Cool. Before moving on to the final chapters, I had one more important piece of preparations. After all this time demolishing our foes and looking absolutely spectacular in the process, Fugado had earned a very special place in my heart, and I decided to give him the Pact Ring. Of course, you can use Engage Plus with anyone, but I'd like to limit the special feature to my S-Support partner, and I knew it would be helpful as I moved on to have Fugado destroy Chapter 25. This is another chapter I could have one-turned with Augment Rewarp, but I decided to take a little more time to fight the generic enemies. I had Amber weaken the first Entrap High Priest with Astra Storm, so after Alir and Fugado got warped to the center of the map, Alir could engage with Fugado and defeat the High Priest, triggering Attuned. With that stat boost, Fugado was fast enough to double the heroes, and he had enough Avoid with Bond Forager to dodge tank sweep the entire central room. Since Alir wasn't using Lucina, I could instead put her on Boucheron, so after setting up some very close kills in the east, he got a ton of experience, and I can now say I trained my entire team to internal level 30. Cool. And because Fugado wasn't using Erika, I could put her on Kagetsu, so he could just barely one-round these really tough corrupted enemies. After a couple turns, the eastern group got pretty overwhelmed, but I held my ground by tanking with Clan and using many obstructs, so I could continue getting kills up until I had defeated Lumera. Fortunately, the western group moved quickly, with Pendreo, Amber, Alfred, and Alchrist getting rewarped over turn 2. At the same time, Fugado and Delir defeated the second Entrap High Priest and started clearing out Lumera's room. Again, their high avoid kept them alive, but I was surprised by Fugado getting hit by an Entrap near Lumera. So by turn 3, I was already fighting the boss group, with Holy Aura letting Fugado one-round even the Corrupted Worms. On turn 4, I got the Draco Shield chest with Alfred, and with an Augment Silence hitting the High Priest, I could move everyone else north and team up against Lumera. Fugado finished the first kill while breaking her chain guards with the magical art Dragon's Fists. Amber and Pendreo teamed up for the second, and before realizing she was on her last health bar, I was trigger happy to have Alir one-round with Dragon's Fist. So I didn't even get to do a cool Bond Blast one-shot with Fugado, but alas, I had to be satisfied with my 4-turn clear. And then only one chapter remained. Upon confronting Sombron, we intimidate him with the power of friendship and the power of our midriffs, and then jump into Phase 1. Alfred charged forward and weakened Sombron with Draconic Hex, and I used some repositions and warps to get everyone else set up. Clan and Gregory weakened a Halberdier, so that after Alir engaged with Fugado, he could get a kill and set up a tune for Fugado, who could then one-round another Halberdier to set up a tune for Alir. Then after a Goddess Dance, I was ready to get all 3 Sombron kills. Clan got the first with an L-Surge crit, Alir one-rounded the second with Holy Aura effective Dragon's Fist, and Fugado destroyed the third with a huge effective Bolganone Strike. So by turn 2, I moved on to Phase 2. As the Marth user, Mavier could one-round the Shadow Dragon Dark Emblem's first health bar, and I had Fogado re-engage with Alir before finishing the second. I teamed up for the Genealogy Dark Emblem kills, ending off with Rosado in range of the Southeastern Griffin Knights. I had given him the last Spirit Dust, so he was just barely able to reach their Oko threshold, pulling off one last mini Vantage Sweep. As for the Southwestern Wyvern Knights, I had Amber take one out with Astra Storm turn 2, and then weaken the second turn 3, setting up the kill for Rosado while using Warp Ragnarok to catch up with the Western group. It took a couple turns to make my way to the northern bosses, but Fogado did great dodge tanking the northwest, while Pendreo and Clan led the eastern group, teaming up for their kills. By turn 4, I had reached the Thracia Dark Emblem, with a momentum-boosted, effective quadruple hit from Boucheron going crazy. I saved the Gaiden Dark Emblem though, so on turn 5, Rosado could one-round both health bars with Echo, and everyone else was available to rush Sombron. Pendreo struck first, applying Draconic Hex and setting up the first kill for Amber with Muligir. Then Mavier used Lodestar Rush, setting up the second kill for Alir with Dragon's Fist. For the third, Clan did a bit of damage with Ragnell, so Fogado could get the kill with Bolganone. And with a Goddess Dance, I refreshed Fogado, who, with the Mystic Tag Goddess Dance Magic Boost and Divinely Inspiring, one-rounded Sombron's final health bar. And that's the run. Overall, I thought this was a really fun experience. Obviously, I enjoyed the copious magical combat and seeing everyone in the funny sage outfits, but I was surprised by how interesting it was to incorporate emblems into the team. Despite everyone being in the same class, there were a lot of unique builds I could make to balance out the shortcoming of sages, and ensure I had several strong combat units, despite most of the male cast not being magically inclined. What was also surprising is how the run didn't necessarily feel that much more challenging because of the class restriction, and it mostly just spiced up my typical strategies. There were some moments that felt rough, like fighting large groups of enemy sages and high priests, but I think as far as class solo runs go, you could do a lot worse than Sage. Magical combat is really strong against most enemies, while having 1-2 range, and not only do you get staff access, but everyone has staff access, so you can spam movement staves, healing, and many obstructs all in the same turn. The main downsides I felt were low bulk, no flyers, and no dancer. The 43 HP cap and 20 defense cap is pretty terrible, but Lucina, Ike, and Roy are all great for shrugging off attacks, so if you work around their engage cycles, it's like, fine. Flight is nice, but there's not much I couldn't replicate with smart usage of Warp and Rescue. No Dancer also meant I had to pull out more movement saves for some plays, and Goddess Dance only enabled each unit to act twice per turn, rather than 4. Still, with multiple strong combat units, this didn't feel too bad, and I could still pull off late game warp skips when I wanted to. Alright, now lastly, I'd like to do a quick team review. Bunet didn't get deployed much, but when he did, he sure proved that even if you're never in combat, there's always something sages can do between reposition and basic staff utility. Mavier wasn't around for long either, but he at least had some pretty strong filler combat for the late game chapters with a speed boost. Not the most impressive, but I certainly think you can get some strong use out of him if you reserve a good emblem for him and maybe give him the chapter 22 Speedwing. On the other hand, Boucheron was around and deployed a lot, and I was a little surprised by how I could find a few moments for him to be a leading combat unit. Still, he wasn't actually that fast, and you'd have to go all out on him if you wanted him to consistently have strong combat across a full run. The Solm squad then felt well suited for the switch into Sage. I enjoyed boosting Rosado's decent magic as much as I could to reach Excalibur Oko thresholds, and it was nice that he could sweep large groups of dodgy wyverns and griffins all on his own. Inheriting a hit plus earlier might have been nice though, since the Ike engrave doesn't give any hits, and he doesn't get Stunning Smile against the few female Griffin Knights. Kaketsu didn't come online until we got Roy back, but it was great having a unit that could actually live late game enemies on their own, and killing mages with 1-2 range was a huge relief. Just a little awkward that he had to wait for Cantor, and then had to choose between Cantor, Gentility, and Speed Plus later on. Jumping ahead to Pendreo, I thought it was cool to see that he didn't need much stat stacking to reach the mid-tier 1-round thresholds, so he could kill things while also filling a utility role with Corrin. I guess you could invest in him more, but for the sake of the team as a whole, that investment felt much more appreciated on my other units. I am glad I went all in on Amber though. giving him the first energy drops and Lin. Scraping out 1 rounds against magical enemies was very close, but also pretty fun, making Amber feel like one of the more unique approaches to come from a run like this. I don't really have as much to say for the Firenese and Brodian princes though. You would probably have to give them everything to be more dominant combat forces, but they did well enough early on against unpromoted enemies, and I was fine to let them ride off their emblem skills going forward. Goddess Dance and Augment were of course amazing for aggressive plays, and even Gallop proved to be nichely useful late game, letting Alfred run around for big rescue plays and get in range to weaken faraway enemies without needing a warp himself. I think Gregory could very easily be a dominant combat force, I just actively chose not to. But even then, I thought Tiki's combo of Dark Breath, Bulk, and Luck Boost were pretty neat for a filler unit, helping him reliably set up kills and land status saves with Divine Pulse. Clan was certainly one of my favorite units to come from the run, with his great speed letting him 1 round even while holding the Ike Ring that didn't help his combat whatsoever. He very quickly relied on crits, but I thought the combo of Elsurge, the Corn Engrave, and Wrath was a pretty clever way to make this semi-reliable. Like Kagetsu, he couldn't always slot in Cancer at the end, but you could probably give him all the Spirit Dusts, or use this build on Pandreo, to drop the need for Gentility. Alir was in a similar position to the Brodian brothers, mostly just being an emblem wielder, but I really do think he could fill a decent combat role like Clan or Rosado if your Bonded Shield Sweeper doesn't want Divinely Inspiring. Of course, my Bonded Shield Sweeper did appreciate it, with my MVP Fagado reaching so many 1-round thresholds between his great speed and a big damage boost. Maybe not the most complex build, outside of switching between Bravery and Gentility, but having a unit that could kill everything in sight was the center of my strategies for most maps, being able to sweep any large group of generic enemies, and take out 2 boss health bars with a Goddess Dance. If I were to use a Sage as a 1-rounding machine again though, I would consider if you could leave Byleth on them for the whole run. You'd lose out on the ability to Goddess Dance or Instruct them, but you would get to use the Thyrsus, and Juggernauting with 1 to 4 range was such a powerful feeling. Oh, and my last piece of advice, make sure to give Fagado the Pact Ring. He's adorable, and he absolutely deserves it. And that's it for now. This was certainly a very indulgent run for myself, but I hope you enjoyed seeing my Sages in action. If you have any cool experiences with Sages in Engage, I'd love to hear about them in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed the video, consider leaving a like and subscribing to support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.